Welcome back to the Marvel Movie Minute, a daily podcast in which we assemble to explore the films of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, 1 minute at a time. In this, our 6th season, we are looking at The Avengers. I'm Andy Nelson from the Next Reel Film Podcast.
And I'm Pete Wright, girded for glorious battle.
Today we're talking about Minute 30, which begins with Coulson's input and ends with the other's question. Back on the show from earlier in the week, it's author Matthew Costello. Hello, Matthew.
Hello. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's always nice to have a guest who's been on long enough or enough times that you feel like you know exactly why they picked this minute based on a single line.
Which is?
We could use a little old-fashioned. All about the stars and stripes for you, man. I know this is going to be an ideological minute because you're not here for a tour of wiry caves.
Actually, that is part of it, but it's almost a little bit more Coulson and also the structure of this minute, right?
Yeah.
I love the camera work in the Quinjet, right? You get the two shot and then the reverse shot of the two of them talking to each other.
So much sincerity. They're very sincere.
Much sincerity. That lighting on Captain America at the end that sort of gives him almost a halo.
Yeah.
And then you cut to the dark, dingy terrorist basement where the Chitauri are doing their evil things. And so it really is a form of and function moment here that works really well. This is a wonderfully constructed scene change. It's a wonderfully constructed mise en scène for the shot, to give us Coulson and Cap talking together. And it really is the moment when Coulson becomes the ideological heart of the film, right? This is the moment when, he wants to show Cap his trading cards. He had some input into the suit, right? And he's a fanboy, right? It's that
Very
moment
much,
when that fanboy shows up. But he's not just a fanboy of Captain America. He's a fanboy of Captain America and everything Captain America represented in 1940.
Yeah.
Too.
Right.
But may not represent anymore.
Right.
So, yes, the ideological redemptive element of it, but also the way it's all constructed, I think works really well.
It is interesting coming in. I mean, this conversation between Coulson and Steve is a pretty interesting one. The dynamic between the two, it really feels as it's starting. I mean, Coulson has felt very much fanboy from the start of this scene, right? And Steve has been kind of much more serious. He's looking at the footage of Hulk and he's trying to get a read on everything. And then the way that this scene or this minute starts of watching the two of them, and he's talking about how he had some input to the modifications that they made on Captain America's uniform. And it kind of plays interesting. And then just the whole idea of Steve is surprised that he's going to be wearing a uniform again. And because, his uniform in the Captain America, the First Avenger, definitely kind of was birthed from what he had been wearing on the stage shows. And that's kind of where that came to be. And then from the stage shows to all of the work that he had been doing in the films and stuff. And so he very much kind of was created as this character. And so the idea of having this uniform, I find that it's such an interesting conversation to be had at this point in the film, and then what we get from him here, and then in subsequent films about him having kind of the uniform. If you're going to have any of these characters in a uniform, it really is Steve over the course of the film. We'll see him in his, the Stars and Stripes, for the bulk of the film. And it does feel like of all the characters, he does kind of have that more old-fashioned sort of feel to what they're doing with the character and the comic look that we get. I think that's an interesting angle to take. And also, I guess it kind of ties into this idea of Phil's logic as far as people just might need a little old-fashioned. How does all of that play for the two of you as far as the uniform and Coulson's approach?
It plays well for me, right? If I'm looking at this scene and thinking about Coulson, right?
Mm-hmm.
Coulson's a true believer, right? He's a Fury minion, but he's a true believer. Like Cap was a true believer in the first film, right? He is a true believer in we are a democratic people and we are threatened and we need to stop this sort of thing, right? But in order actually to have that happen, what happens in this film? Coulson dies. Coulson has to die. The ideological true believer has to die. And Fury manipulates his death to create sort of a myth around him that brings the others together, right? He spoils the cards, right? Coulson didn't have him on him. Fury's going to put blood on the cards, so it looks like he was wearing them when he was shot. He's going to sort of raise Phil up in this mythic way that he doesn't really exist. And in essence, he's going to build the Avengers on a lie. So all this great defense of America is going to be built on essentially a lie about the fate of the American dreamer.
Well, it says a lot about the whole idea of like the stars and stripes, what Steve says. And it's interesting coming from him. And I guess it ties into this, what we were talking about when we first were talking about when Steve was in the boxing ring and the whole idea of being this man out of time and being kind of angry and everything. And he's coming into this conversation with Coulson here, talking about his uniform, saying, aren't stars and stripes a little old fashioned? And that coming from him, that is really interesting to see. He is starting to understand kind of like the change in Americanism over time, how the USA is represented in the world, a little more of a cynical view on things. And so it's interesting to see that he's kind of, there is some sense of him starting to read into that a little bit.
Yeah, and we'll watch his relationship to the costume, right, throughout the series of films is very important, right? The costume he wears in the first Avenger is essentially a leather military uniform with elements of the stage costume on it. What he wears in this film is almost identical to the stage costume in some way. When we come into the Winter Soldier, he's going to be wearing the uniform that he wears when he's Steve Rogers, super soldier, and no longer Captain America. But when he comes to the final battle against Hydra, he redons that traditional costume. So that traditional costume reflects, right, the moments when Steve is willing to say, yes, I'm going to fight for these things, right? That these things are still worth fighting for. But it's always tempered by the fact that he doesn't wear it all the time. And his relationship with it is much more sophisticated, much more self-conscious than it was initially. I agree. I think that's what we see being born here.
Yeah. I think that also goes into support that in the first Avenger, Steve, as our protagonist, was not our change character, right? Steve was this vessel around which all these other characters changed, right? He was the planet around everyone else's orbit. And in this movie, Steve needs to change, right? Steve is in himself a vessel of change, and that uniform becomes a barometer of his ideology, right? And his willingness to support a cause. My big question has always been for this movie, would Steve have changed had Fury not bloodied the cards, right? Like, was there still enough cap in Steve to allow him his own journey and not build the Avengers on a lie, as you say? Because I think what he is, the sincerity that he brings here, the sincerity that he brings when looking at this true fanboy, this true believer, might have been enough to push him over the edge. And so it's always sort of ideologically infuriating to me that we end up with this mess of that filthies the purity of the Avengers, even insofar as it makes them more complex and interesting. So
yeah, no, I actually agree. I think that the change that occurs in Cap might very well have happened without the bloodying of the cards. But the bloodying of the cards turns that patriotism, right, into a sham at some level.
Which is another message of the movie, right?
Right. If you think about 2011 by that point, we're 8 years after the invasion of Iraq, we're 8 years after, right, people pointing and saying, if you don't do what we want, you're not being patriotic. Any opposition to what we want is unpatriotic. And it's a very anti-democratic message. And I think in some ways it's a turning point for the whole Marvel universe, right? Because up to this point, these films have been somewhat critical of that, right? And at this moment, they start to embrace it. And by the time we hit, Iron Man 3, right, we're, full on nationalists, right? Full on, it's going to build an armor around the world, Ultron thing, right?
Yeah, that really becomes the crux of the relationship between Steve and Tony we'll see Steve kind of developing in a different direction through Winter Soldier, and then, of course, it all leads to Civil War. And so all of this is kind of this development that we're getting with the character and these, ideological views that I suppose to a certain extent there was the design element of Kevin Feige putting all of these puzzle pieces into place so that he could get there with these later stories. But it is interesting to see in that moment, as the team is formed here, I guess to a certain extent, it feels like this is how something like the Avengers is going to be formed today in 2012, as opposed to how it potentially could have come together in 1945, when Steve was fighting Hydra. And I suppose that there's an element of that also comes into play.
Yes, I think that's true. I think that's true. But I think this is that moment when we start to get that ideological muddying that's going to keep getting worse and worse and worse until we hit the mess that is Civil War. I mean, Civil War is just, oh my God, right? And everything sits there to set up sort of Endgame and Infinity War, which are incredibly satisfying as ends to a story at some level, but they aren't particularly interesting films, right?
Pixel parades, for sure.
And I think through here, they still were kind of interesting films.
I think Winter Soldier also accelerates that, very much so. And that, in fact, takes Cap's character and makes all the confusion, the ideological confusion, and pits him against his handlers. And that is an important transformation that he has to go through, but he can't get there until he goes through this.
Right. Oh, yes. Oh, I agree. I like the movement with Cap through that. I think Winter Soldier is one of my favorites. It's, I can watch that in 3 days of the Condor back to back over.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Truly.
It's interesting. And now I'm curious, just from your perspective, like, how would you rank the 4 Avengers films and the 3 Captain America films? Like, do you have a sense as to like your favorite down to like what you would find the least interesting?
I like the first Avenger. I think is probably the most thoughtful film of the bunch. I think Joe Johnston did a wonderful job. I really like the Winter Soldier. I think that the Russo brothers? I think they did a very good job there as well. Civil War, I think, is terrible. Ultron is kind of a mess too.
Mm-hmm.
Endgame and Infinity War, there was nothing absolutely surprising about them at all. Infinity War worked wonderfully for me because they gave Cap his happy ending,
mm-hmm.
and they had those great manipulative moments. Iron Man, and Black Widow.
Right, they're perfectly adrenal films.
Yeah. The same way that Armageddon hits you in the right way in certain ways, but it's not the kind of film you're going to nominate for an Oscar, right? I enjoyed Kenneth Branagh's Thor a lot.
Yeah.
Iron Man 1 was okay. I mean, it was a great film. It was really fun. It was fun. I actually didn't hate Iron Man 2 in the same way most everybody seems to have. I'm having trouble watching anything after Infinity War. Wakanda Forever was okay. I think Shang-Chi was wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting though. And I think that there's going to be things that work and things that don't work in pretty much all of these films. And I think the staying power may boil down sometimes to, it might for some just be quippy lines and great action sequences, but I think some of them, like the Winter Soldier, which really stand out for me also, is because there's a little more going on with it, and they're saying something a little more interesting there. And so I'm very much looking forward to getting to that one for sure.
Yeah, I think this is a point I made earlier, that the films that are about the characters more than about the heroes fighting each other, are the ones that work. Iron Man 1 is about a guy whose his life's work is shown to be a disaster in front of him, and how he responds to that. Thor 1 was all about hubris versus humility, which is what Thor was all about.
Same can be said for Doctor Strange.
Same can be said for Doctor Strange. And they work when they are done at that level. The Infinity War and Endgame weren't really at that level. They were, let's put the costumes on and go like CGI ourselves blind. With these few poignant moments that work if you are embedded in the narrative.
Yeah.
Right. And so they are like true popcorn films that don't aspire to more. I think that what worked best and got people involved with these characters was that these early films aspired to more.
Yeah.
Frankly, I think Avengers works. I think it works really well. I think it's an ideological muddle, but it's a very entertaining film and it draws us in very well, largely because we care about these films and Joss Whedon did a great job of melding these like strong characters and strong egos together. He herded the cats well.
Herded the cats well, and there's a lot of strong structure for it. And I suppose to a certain extent that leads me to the next part of this minute when we go to Loki's lair, because this gives us a chance to talk a little bit about the villain of our story. And, that's something that, we've been talking a lot about these heroes in the story, but I'd love to get your sense of how Loki works for you. Obviously we had seen him in Thor before, but now we're getting him in a bigger scale. He obviously was a key villain in the Avengers comics. How does he play for you in the context of this film and the way that they set up his storyline?
Loki's one of those characters who he's appealing because he's so impish. And Tom Hiddleston plays that impishness perfectly. But there is absolutely zero moral core to this character. He will sell anyone out at any time for any reason whatsoever, largely just because it's fun. He's the god of mischief. He doesn't care about anything else. He'll screw over his brother. He'll screw over his mother. He'll screw over the earth. He does not care. And there's this implication here that he's doing this for power. It's not really for power. He's just doing it to do it. And Tom Hiddleston, I think, captures that sort of puckish sense of him that makes him appealing, as well as that just complete and total amorality and disregard for anything else aside from, I'm just going to do this because I can.
Yeah, I think one of our previous guests described him in Dungeons and Dragons terms as chaotic evil. Like he's just there. He just loves the chaos of what he can do, with any particular situation.
Which is, in a sense, right, if we want to think about this in terms of dichotomy, it may be in part that we use Loki here that becomes a big part of the problem for the cinematic universe ideologically, because what is the opposite of chaos but order, right? And order is not necessarily a good product of democratic equality at some level.
Does the Batman exist without the Joker? And
no, right?
Is the Batman's existence good for democratic equality?
Not at all. Batman is a fascist. There's just no question about it.
Right.
And in fact, by the time we get to Ultron, right, Tony's pretty close.
Yeah.
And so the presence of Loki as the chief villain here, right, I think sort of pushes the films in that direction. But I think it also pushed the comic books in that direction too. The problem is, of course, he's such an appealing character. You want him to be redeemable. And he never is.
Well, he never is until they, they just did, like at this point, they thought they knew what they had with Loki and Tom Hiddleston, and practically his popularity transcended their intentions. And they had to do something with this character to make him more than, because they had to keep Hiddleston around.
Oh, yeah. He's perfect as Loki.
He's perfect.
He really is.
And he actually, I think he, as a performer, transcends that himself, that he is able to deliver the complexity of the ultimate Loki that we get in a way that's still satisfying and impish and troublesome and all of that. But that's down to him, and certainly not the character that we introduce here.
And he can wear that headdress.
So
and
good.
Oh,
and you don't look at him and go, really, dude? He gets away with it.
He absolutely does. And it looks so much better than his scepter generally ever does. Like, it actually looks authentic, whereas his scepter, as we've talked about, it looks a little plastic sometimes when he's holding it. It looks like a prop.
Loki's Scepter by Hasbro Pulse.
Exactly. This lair that they're in, they filmed it in under the Detroit Superior Bridge in the old viaduct in Cleveland, Ohio, where they were filming a number of things. It's an interesting location, I suppose. It did make me wonder. I mean, this whole thing, story, this is why you never want to spend too much time looking at timelines in the Marvel Wiki, because this entire thing is 2 days after the destruction of Project Pegasus. So they have had basically less than 48 hours to assemble. I don't know how he's getting all these people, where he's getting them. They look kind of military scientific. Did he go to a military base and mind control a whole bunch of people? Like, the whole thing seems fairly strange to me, especially when you see the progress that Eric has made with whatever this Tesseract device is that he's building, or basically rebuilding from. It looks very similar to what he had at Project Pegasus. The scene plays like Loki's been busy. I do like that, but I don't know. Before we talk about Loki's little trip to Sanctuary, I mean, how does it play for the two of you as far as kind of getting a sense of what Loki's been up to?
I hadn't realized it was only supposed to be 2 days.
Again, yeah, these timelines.
Yeah, that's why you never look at the timeline, man. Yeah. You never look at the
Maybe
timeline.
He's been out recruiting all these people beforehand and just came and got,
Well, that was right. Little do you know, when you zapped into the thing in the beginning, he was just coming from Boston. Like,
that's right.
It's fine.
Yeah, it's just a day trip. I'll be back with a couple guys.
Exactly.
We'll pick up some equipment on the way at Radio Shack.
That makes so much more sense now that he's already been doing all this.
He's already doing all this prep work.
Yeah.
Location scouting.
Yeah, exactly. He's had a lot of prep that he's had to get ready, and he's been. It's like what you do on any project. You don't bring in your big money people until the last minute because you don't want them sitting around bored, right? So he's got all of the foundation ready. So as soon as Eric gets there, he already has everything he needs to get to work. That's a smart strategist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He could take over Twitter. He could buy Twitter.
It's possible he has, Matthew.
Twitter by Loki. Yeah. All right. Well, so they're busy. They're doing all sorts of stuff. Now, again, I don't fully understand exactly this whole thing, the way that he's using the scepter to mentally teleport himself to Sanctuary and around. But I guess that's what he's doing. And he's going there to have this conversation with the other. I don't know. I mean, is he going periodically to just do check-ins? Was there some message that popped up from the other saying, hey, it's time to check in. We need to have a conversation. I'm not exactly sure how and why these things happen, but the other obviously is ready to have this conversation and is there. And weirdly, when we cut to the shot of her, or when we see him on Sanctuary, we see Loki on Sanctuary, and we're looking at the other, it looks like we're only seeing his top half. And it really throws me every time I look at this particular minute. And after this, at the very end of this minute, we got a frame or two where we see a different angle and we see he's behind a rock outcropping or something, but it doesn't make any sense in this shot at all. It looks like we're seeing half of a body. How does this play? Does this work at all for either of you? Because I really struggle every time I watch this moment.
I don't know, did Loki go? Did Loki choose to go, or was Loki summoned and taken there through the scepter? I've always been a little confused about that. This is you're getting called to the principal's office. You're not moving fast enough, dude.
Yeah.
Right. That's an infraction. You're going to have to stay detention. Right. And he's arguing against it. It's a weird thing. Are they really at a place, or is this just sort of a place where both of them meet?
It's a very strange shot too, because we pivot around Loki sitting in Detroit. And then we see Loki in his full dress walk in front of seated Loki to have the conversation. It's very strange. It's very strange. He's visualizing the conversation that they're having.
Yeah, right. He's mentally projecting himself, I guess. Is that what we're supposed to take from this?
I like the idea that he's summoned. I like that idea. He's sitting there in Detroit and the scepter just starts to glow and it's oh crap, I can't flush this call. He has to take it.
Yeah.
Yeah, the president of Hasbro needs to talk to him.
Exactly.
No.
Yeah, it's. I mean, it clearly looks like when you watch Hiddleston like perform it, it looks like he's mentally like doing something, because as he's sitting there, like the scepter starts to glow, and it's almost like he takes this big deep breath and like stretches his neck back and closes his eyes, and then I guess that's the visual of us seeing him mentally projecting himself across time and space to get to Sanctuary, where he sees. The other weird thing about this is, as he appears, as Loki in his full regalia appears, he looks like twice the size of the other. Like the other looks like a tiny, like a Jawa is really what he looks like.
It's a full Gandalf Frodo kind of a thing. Like they're forced perspectiving it, and it's not great.
Yeah. I guess, we're 30 minutes into the film. I guess this is really a reminder to say the Chitauri again, just to remind us, oh yeah, we're talking about something at the start of this movie. I can't remember exactly what they are, but there's something out there that I'm supposed to remember, and that's what this is.
That's Joss Whedon saying, you guys, I know you've already forgotten that opening scene, because it was nonsense. What you really remember is the destruction of the building, and we're going to take you back there just one more time.
Yeah. Here, bad guys. You need a bad guy moment to remind you there are bad guys beyond Loki. It's a plot point. It's just a right.
Yeah. What do you think of the Chitauri? Do you, as far as villains, kind of an army, does it work for you?
They were in the I can't remember, the late 90s, early 2000s. Marvel started this line called the Ultimate Line.
Yeah.
Which they were retelling a lot of their old stories in new ways. This is where Nick Fury became black with an eye patch.
Mm-hmm.
And it's where the Chitauri showed up. They never existed before then. I think they were supposed to be like the stand-in for the Kree, but we still have the Kree. They never really seemed all that. What's their intention? They're minions. They just strike me as minions. But there's a lot of them, and they're dangerous minions, so that's okay.
Yeah, and I guess that's what we get from them, right?
Right, because what it turns out is that they're not the ones we really worry about. Thanos is the one who's back there.
Yeah.
Who we catch a glimpse of at the end of the film.
It just boils down to our villain needs a massive army to invade with. And so, hey, let's give them these things. And, it definitely comes across that way in this film. And
it is army for hire, and the name Uruk-hai was taken. And so here we are. Yeah. Well, that's pretty much where we end this minute. Loki has his little pitch to the other as far as, oh, no, it's all good. Let them goad themselves. I will lead them in a glorious battle. It's his way of just saying, no, I've totally got this. It's all good. And then that's where the minute ends. So, well, I guess that's pretty much it for this minute and this week. But Matthew, it has been a thrill chatting with you. You'll be back later in the season. I'm glad that we had a chance to catch up with you about this minute and earlier in the week. So thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. I love coming on and talking about these movies with you guys. So
yeah, well, tell everybody again about where they can track you down and read some of the stuff that you've been working on.
Well, you can still find my book, Secret Identity Crisis. Comic books and the Unmasking of the Cold War at Amazon and other places. You can probably find it really cheap if you want to buy it used or remaindered. I have some articles coming out, one recently in the Journal of Popular Culture on Jack Kirby and his work in the late 60s and early 70s from the Fantastic Four through the Eternals. So that's what I've been working on, and watching movies.
Well, make sure you share that link with us when you have that available. We'll make sure to share it out with everybody. And then we'll chat with you later in the season. So again, thank you so much. We appreciate it. And Pete, thanks as always.
Oh, Andy, next week. I hope we do a whole week on the Six-Fingered Man.
Until next time, true believers.
Marvel Movie Minute is a production of True Story FM, engineering by Andy Nelson. This season's music is Message to the World by Anthony Vega, and this season's show art is by Winston Yabo. Find the show at truestory.fm. If your podcast app allows ratings and reviews, please consider doing that for our show.